Tonight, a war crossed a line the world was never supposed to see broken. Not after years of warnings, not after endless threats, and certainly not without consequences. 6 hours. That's all it took to expose the most dangerous illusion of this war. 6 hours that forced Moscow into silence instead of retaliation. 6 hours that revealed how quickly fear collapses when it's finally challenged. For months, you were told restraint kept the world safe, that escalation would be catastrophic, that some targets were untouchable. But tonight, those assumptions cracked. Ukraine didn't ask for permission. Russia didn't respond with force. And the White House didn't object. If you want to understand how power really works, not how it's described in speeches, but how it behaves under pressure. Stay with me. Because what happened today wasn't an attack. It was a test, and the result changed everything. To see why we need to confront the question we've been avoiding. What we are really talking about tonight is not Ukraine, and it's not Russia either. We are talking about a system that has governed this war from the very beginning. A system built on fear management, on escalation control, on the belief that stability comes from restraint, not resolve. For nearly 3 years, Western strategy has revolved around a single question. What will Putin do if Ukraine goes too far? That question shaped every weapons delivery, every red line, every quiet phone call between capitals. And over time, that question hardened into an assumption that Russia's nuclear threats were not just dangerous, but decisive, that they imposed a ceiling no one dared to touch. Ukraine understood this system better than anyone. They lived under it. They bled under it. And eventually, they reached a conclusion the West was unwilling to face. That the system itself had become the problem. Because when fear defines strategy, it doesn't prevent escalation. It merely postpones the moment when someone decides the cost of waiting is higher than the risk of acting. And that brings us to how this logic was built in the first place. To understand how we arrived here, you have to step back from today's strikes and look at the architecture of this war. From the very start, Russia didn't rely primarily on battlefield dominance. It relied on anticipation, on the threat of what might happen if certain lines were crossed. Nuclear rhetoric became a substitute for strategic flexibility. Every warning was designed to shape behavior in advance, not to be acted upon later. And for a long time, it worked. Western capitals internalized a logic of risk minimization. Weapons were delivered slowly. Capabilities were segmented. Distance became policy. Ukraine, meanwhile, adapted to this environment. Its operations were aggressive but patterned, escalatory but legible. Each strike fit within an unspoken framework designed to reassure allies as much as to pressure Moscow. This created a fragile equilibrium, not peace, not victory, but managed paralysis. Yet every system built on threats faces a structural problem. The more often a threat is repeated without consequence, the more it loses coercive power. Deterrence decays quietly until the moment it fails publicly. And over the past 18 months, the signs of that decay became impossible to ignore, which is why the first real rupture didn't come from diplomacy. It came from silence. The rupture didn't announce itself with sirens or speeches. It arrived as a deviation. For 18 months, Ukraine's actions followed a recognizable rhythm: strike, pause, signal, a logic that intelligence services could map and predict. Then, abruptly, that logic disappeared. Units were redeployed without explanation. Communications went dark where there was usually noise. Capabilities that had been carefully conserved were suddenly repositioned. And when a system built on constant signals falls silent, professionals know what that means. It means the decision has already been made. What followed was not escalation in the traditional sense. It was precision compressed into hours, not weeks, sequenced to exploit confusion rather than provoke reaction. This wasn't about symbolism. It was about exposure. Exposure of how quickly a supposedly untouchable infrastructure could be reached. exposure of how unprepared deterrence looks when it's never meant to be used, and exposure of a deeper truth the West had quietly avoided. That restraint had stopped being stabilizing. It had become predictable. If you're still watching, this is the moment to pay attention. Because once predictability disappears, systems behave very differently. And to understand why this moment mattered so much, we need to look beneath the surface at what was actually being targeted. What mattered most about this operation wasn't where the strikes landed. It was what they were designed to undermine. Ukraine didn't target territory for its own sake. It targeted the mechanisms that allow power to project itself over distance. Runways, node, early warning systems, the infrastructure that turns threats into capability. Strategic aviation sits at the center of Russia's escalation narrative, not because it's constantly used, but because it's constantly referenced. It is the silent backdrop to every warning issued since this war began. By striking that backbone, Ukraine wasn't chasing destruction. It was challenging credibility. Credibility is the true currency of deterrence. Once it erodes, numbers and arsenals become less relevant. What matters is whether the threat holder is believed. This is why the response in Moscow wasn't immediate retaliation. It was assessment, emergency meetings, information control. When a system depends on intimidation, any sign of hesitation becomes destabilizing. And tonight, hesitation was visible. Ukraine understood this calculus. They weren't asking how Russia could respond. They were testing how Russia would respond. And the answer arrived not through missiles, but through restraint. Which brings us to the second rupture, the moment when silence turned into something far more dangerous. The second rupture didn't come from a new strike. It came from what followed. Russia didn't escalate across borders. It didn't shift nuclear forces forward. It didn't attempt to reassert dominance through spectacle. Instead, it froze. And freezing under pressure is never neutral. It creates space. And space in war is opportunity. Ukraine didn't wait. Subsequent actions moved faster, tighter, and across multiple domains. Air, sea, rail, cyber. Each operation calibrated to compound confusion, not to invite retaliation. This sequencing matters more than any single hit because it shows who controls tempo. And in modern conflict, tempo is power. For the first time in this war, Russia wasn't reacting strategically. It was reacting administratively, meetings, briefings, internal debates. Meanwhile, Ukraine demonstrated something profoundly destabilizing. That escalation doesn't always come from aggression. Sometimes it comes from clarity. Clarity that the threat you've been warned about is less real than the fear it produced. Clarity that waiting carries its own cost. Clarity that momentum favors the actor willing to move first. At that moment, the conflict crossed an invisible threshold, not of violence, but of belief. And once belief shifts, the consequences don't stay confined to the battlefield. They move outward, toward people. If you're wondering what all of this means for you, this is where the story stops being abstract. Because when systems break, ordinary people feel it first. Not through headlines, through uncertainty. For Ukrainians, this moment carries a brutal clarity. They have learned that waiting for permission prolongs suffering. That restraint imposed from the outside does not protect homes, families, or futures. So when Ukraine accelerated, it wasn't bravado, it was survival logic. And if you live far from this war, don't mistake distance for insulation. Energy prices, food supply chains, security guarantees, they all rest on whether deterrence actually works. For 18 months, your safety was quietly tied to the assumption that fear would hold, that someone else's threats would restrain someone else's actions. Tonight, that assumption cracked. This is the uncomfortable truth. Stability doesn't come from pretending danger doesn't exist. It comes from confronting it, honestly. If you want to understand the world you're moving into, not the one we were promised, stay with me. Share this. Because these shifts don't announce themselves twice. And as this shockwave moves outward, its impact doesn't stop with civilians. It reaches alliances, borders, and the global balance itself. Once a ceiling collapses in one place, it doesn't stay local. It sends a signal. Allies watch carefully how power reacts when it's challenged. Adversaries do the same. And tonight, the message traveling across capitals is unmistakable. For NATO, this moment is destabilizing but clarifying. For years, cohesion was maintained by caution. Unity was defined by what members agreed not to do. Now that framework is under strain. When Ukraine demonstrated that deep strikes would not trigger nuclear retaliation, it forced every alliance partner to reassess their own assumptions. What was once considered reckless now looks overdue. What was once too escalatory now appears strategically misread. This doesn't automatically lead to wider war, but it does accelerate decision-making. Governments that moved slowly now face pressure to explain why. Restrictions that once seemed prudent are being reevaluated in real time, and the credibility of deterrence on both sides is being recalculated. For Russia, this is worse. Its threats no longer just fail to deter Ukraine, they fail to reassure partners, intimidate rivals, or stabilize its own position. Power that relies on fear must constantly demonstrate relevance. The moment it doesn't influence decays fast. And as these recalculations spread, one question dominates every briefing room. What happens next? To answer that, we have to look forward and consider the paths this moment opens. From here, the future branches quickly. And none of the paths are comfortable. The first scenario is restraint disguised as adaptation. Russia absorbs the shock, avoids dramatic escalation, and slowly recalibrates. The war continues, but under a new logic, one where intimidation no longer sets limits and endurance replaces threat-making. This is the least dangerous path, but also the least decisive. The second scenario is escalation by miscalculation, not nuclear. Conventional, asymmetric, deniable, cyber pressure, infrastructure disruption, actions designed to restore fear without crossing irreversible lines. This path is unstable because it assumes control can be regained after credibility has already cracked. The third scenario is the most dangerous and the most revealing. A leadership cornered by internal pressure decides that hesitation itself is fatal. That appearing weak is worse than risking everything. History shows us that this is how catastrophic decisions are made, not from confidence, but from panic. Ukraine understands these possibilities. So does Washington. So does Moscow. This moment isn't about predicting which path will be chosen. It's about recognizing that the old map no longer applies. The rules that govern behavior for 18 months are gone. What replaces them will be written by decisions made under stress, not theory. And that is why how this moment is interpreted right now matters more than what happened on the battlefield, which brings us to the final question. What are we supposed to learn from this? What we should take from this moment is not triumph and not reassurance. It is responsibility, because today proved something uncomfortable. The limits that shaped this war were never enforced by force. They were enforced by fear. And fear, once challenged, rarely returns in the same form. Ukraine didn't just change the battlefield, it changed the psychology of the conflict. It showed that escalation control based on intimidation eventually collapses under its own weight. And when it does, the world enters a phase where clarity matters more than caution. For policymakers, this is the end of plausible deniability. For alliances, it's the end of half measures disguised as strategy. And for you, watching from the outside, it's a reminder that global stability is not a permanent condition. It's a choice renewed every time power is tested. If you want to understand what comes next, don't look only at missiles or maps. Look at behavior. Look at hesitation. Look at who is forced to react. This story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. If this helped you see the system more clearly, stay with me. Share this, because the next phase won't wait for consensus.